Good day, everyone. My name is Mukund Madhu, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. On behalf of Beroe, I'd like to welcome you all to another webinar from Beroe Insights. In today's webinar, we have our presenters talking about how mergers and acquisitions among API and formulation firms are affecting the supply side. Before we move ahead with the presentation, I have a few general instructions, as always. Please note that all attendees will be placed on mute. During the course of the presentation, if you would like to post questions, you will find a box on the right-hand side, indicated in red. I request you to type in your question and hit the send button. As the presentation progresses, I will note down the frequently asked questions and pose them to the presenter at the end of the session. Should you experience any connectivity issues, I request that you close your window, go back to the email, and try to reconnect using the same link. If there are further problems, please do not hesitate to email Puneet at puneet.ramal@beroe-inc.com. You can also find this in the email shared with you earlier. Moving on, let me quickly introduce our presenters for today's webinar. Pradeep Kasirajan is a pharmaceutical active ingredients expert at Beroe. He specializes in studying sourcing strategies at Fortune 500 pharmaceutical companies. In his over 2 years at Beroe, Pradeep has built on his category expertise in API sourcing strategies and supply chains in the pharmaceutical industry. He has written and published several papers in leading global pharmaceutical magazines. Recently, his research paper on capacity utilization rates in India, ready for the shift of API manufacturing to India, was published by Pharmaceutical Magazine and Packaging Sourcer Magazine. Owais Shah is a pharmaceutical expert at Beroe. He specializes in providing procurement-related intelligence for active pharmaceutical ingredients to global top 20 pharma companies. In his year and a half at Beroe, Owais has built on his extensive knowledge and expertise by working across multiple client projects on small and large molecule APIs. He recently authored a paper highlighting alternate low-cost destinations for API and formulations manufacturing. So without further ado, let me pass it on to Owais.
Thank you, Mukund. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on alternate engagement models for supplier-based management. As we all know, the pharmaceutical industry has changed many ways of doing business over the past several years, in large part due to the losses suffered from patent expirations and weak pipelines. And in this view, outsourcing of manufacturing operations has gained increasing importance over the past years. And as we are aware that outsourcing manufacturing operations is hardly an easy task for any big pharma company, and it requires continuous monitoring and evaluation of the supply chain. Hence, the question of supplier-based management has become one of the key concerns for category managers. There is also no disagreement on the fact that companies have evolved in this process and are now managing their supplier network better than in the past. However, even then, I'm sure that all of us would agree to it, that the question of supplier-based management is still an important milestone in the evolution of any pharma procurement organization. So today, in this webinar, my colleague Pradeep and I would analyze the existing practices and challenges ahead for pharma procurement organizations and see if there are any other possible options that category managers could also look upon while discussing this issue. So today, we will start by touching on brief details on what is driving the need to manage the supplier network, or rather consolidate the suppliers in pharma companies. How have pharma companies adapted to respond to this need, and to what extent can their current practices hold good for the challenges to come? Following that, we would evaluate an alternate approach and assess the extent to which it could help companies manage their suppliers. And finally, we will analyze the global market to see if there are opportunities where this approach could be applied. So to begin with, as I just mentioned, that patent expirations have been an extraordinary challenge for big pharma companies for some time now. And if you look at some figures, Pharma companies have lost about $180 billion to patent expirations over the past 10 years. And this has indeed affected them in many ways, and one of them being decreased capacity utilizations. And to deal with this challenge, we have observed a trend among all big pharma companies where they have sold off or even shut down many of their facilities. To take an example, Novartis has sold about 20 production facilities since past 4 years, and it has enabled them to make savings of about $2.8 billion. Similarly, other companies like Sanofi, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Merck, and even others as well have followed the same trend and sold multiple facilities over the past years. But at the same time, with this restructuring process, they have also increased their reliance on external manufacturing. And today we can say that any big pharma company would have a supplier base of about 200 to 250 suppliers for their manufacturing needs. So it clearly looks that the situation has not been easy so far. At the same time, if we look ahead, estimates suggest that about $100 to $120 billion worth of small molecules will go off patent over the next 5 years. And based on what I have previously brought up, this suggests a further increase in the overall supply base over the next 5 to 7 years. And hence the question of supplier-based management would remain one of the key priorities for the category managers. And while there are various ways of managing the supplier base, supplier consolidation has been proven as an effective solution across industries so far. So at this point, it would be a good idea to take a step back and evaluate the supplier-based management approaches that the industry has been relying upon so far and see how effective it could prove for the time to come. To analyze this, let us first understand how things are currently happening in the industry, how companies are currently engaging with their suppliers, and how do they go about consolidating. At present, we see that companies engage separately with suppliers for APIs and separately with suppliers for formulations. And then they look for consolidation opportunities individually within these two separate sets. Which means API suppliers are manufacturing two different APIs are consolidated to one supplier who can manufacture both the APIs. And similarly, two formulation suppliers manufacturing two different formulations are consolidated to one who can handle both of them. And we have seen several examples of this model in the industry, where almost all of the top players like Merck, AstraZeneca, Sanofi, Johnson & Johnson, Bayer, and even others have engaged with one API supplier for more than one API and one formulation supplier for more than one formulation. So if we are to judge the efficacy of this approach and going by pure mathematical logic, it looks like that this model has the efficiency to consolidate the supplier base to at least half of its size. However, at the same time, when we consider the practical constraints that arise from different product portfolios, geographical distribution of facilities, and other things, we can say this has enabled pharma companies to reduce their supplier base by about 20 to 30%. So if we are to summarize the process so far, we can say that sourcing in pharmaceutical industry has gradually evolved from sourcing a single product from a single supplier to sourcing multiple products from a single supplier. However, as I mentioned just a while back, an important question to ask at this point is if the practices accomplished so far would also hold good for the situation ahead. So to analyze this again, let us see how far this mindset could be effective over time. So going with this approach over time, we can say that pharma companies would still be developing two separate supplier bases, one for the APIs and the other for the formulations. And even then, they could still have large number of suppliers in each category. And over time, with this mindset, it might also become restrained to further consolidate the suppliers within these separate supplier bases, which would then lead to a stagnancy point. So considering this, we have been evaluating a different approach which companies could also look upon as an option and avoid facing such a situation in future. So this approach supports that instead of consolidating an API supplier with an API supplier and a formulation supplier with a formulation supplier, we could look to consolidate an API supplier of drug 1 and the formulation supplier of the same drug to a single integrated supplier, who has both the capabilities. And similarly, we could consolidate the API supplier of drug 2 and the formulation supplier of drug 2 into another integrated supplier who has again both the capabilities. It would also mean that for a new contract, the API and formulation manufacturing could be outsourced to a single player. So the key point of difference in this approach is that it looks at the API supplier and the formulation supplier as one, instead of treating them differently. And in this process also increases the flexibility for further consolidation, which would mean over course of time, these two suppliers could be further consolidated into one integrated player that would handle more than 2 drugs for the buyer. And again, if we have to evaluate the efficiency of the model, and again going first by mathematical logic alone, we can say because of the flexibility this approach offers, this approach has the potential to reduce the supplier base to 1/4 of its size. However, again, as we give considerable amount of weightage to the practical constraints in the market, it would certainly bring down this estimate by large. But it would be logical to assume that it would help the buyers to move ahead from what they would have already achieved, which would mean this approach could help the supplier base to be further reduced beyond 20–50%. So to briefly summarize, we can say that outsourcing by value chain could surely be looked upon as an option apart from outsourcing by function alone.
Wait, a question here. While the model looks lucrative, it appears risky to outsource the entire value chain to a single supplier. Would not such a model strengthen suppliers' influence over pricing? And is it really wise to allow a single supplier to handle all the supply for one product?
Well, Mukund, I would say superficially it does look that way. However, Pradeep with me has been working to analyze this model for its risks and benefits. So let me hand it over to him for a detailed explanation.
Thank you, Owais. Well, I would agree with the point that this model does superficially look more risky, and it looks as if the entire drug manufacturing is outsourced to a single supplier, which makes the risk look higher. However, let us try to analyze closely and see if it is really that way and what could be possibly done to mitigate this risk. So first, to address the question of price control, let us see how different is it than the current approach and if enough transparency in pricing could be achieved to deal with the situation. As we know, to get clarity on pricing, any company develops its own should cost models, which would be of importance in this approach as well. This would help the buyer to understand if the service is overpriced or not, and further enable the visibility of the approximate profit margin at which the suppliers could be operating. This information enables efficient negotiations with the supplier. Once the cost modeling and negotiation is over, now what if the supplier is increasing its prices often? Here, market intelligence teams play an important role. Both in-house and external support would work to keep the buyer updated about the market. And thus, these two tools would help balance the control over pricing, as supplier would need to justify any sudden price increase. As we know that these market intelligence inputs and cost model are already in place in the current model as well, it would not be very different than what it is already being done. In fact, as the buyer and supplier are working more collaboratively and the supplier has more account attractiveness, there is a good chance that transparency could be improved. Moving forward to other major concern which also needs a close evaluation, that is the supply chain security. For this, let us consider an example of supply chain of a recently off-patent drug of a top 5 pharma company. If we see here, the key things to notice are APIs are manufactured at 3 different facilities across the globe, and similarly, formulations are being manufactured at different sites across the globe, including their in-house facilities. This gives an indication that the volumes have been distributed. Similarly, to consider another example, this is the supply chain of a mature brand of a top 10 pharma company. Here also, the APIs and formulations are being manufactured at different facilities and the volumes have again been distributed. Clearly, the companies are working hard to mitigate the supply risk by adopting volume distribution, combination of in-house and outsourcing, and by procuring APIs and formulations from different facilities. Now, how far could the same strategies be adopted while working with a single integrated supplier? And for this, let's analyze the geographical capabilities of one of the top integrated manufacturers. This supplier has 4 API facilities and 7 formulation facilities that are spread across North America, Latin America, and European regions. Now, if a company has to outsource its drugs to such a player, we can say still that APIs and formulation would be manufactured at different facilities and volumes could also be distributed. If implemented, the only difference than the current model would be that the API and formulation were manufactured by 2 different suppliers in different facilities, whereas in this model, both will be manufactured by the same supplier but still at different facilities. From this illustration, we can now say that the level of risk involved is almost the same as that of the current model. At the same time, as this approach would require a stricter selection and monitoring process of the suppliers, the risk might further be minimized as compared to the current model. So, to sum up so far, we can say that both the models have almost the same level of risk involved and same strategies could hold good for the alternate model as well, which are continuous monitoring, volume distribution, and hybrid model of combining in-house and outsourcing. And as evaluated, these strategies are not different from the current model, which could also be a leverage point to buyers in terms of risk mitigation. Now, having discussed about the risk part of this approach, let us now also look at the benefits this approach could provide. Like Owais had been mentioned earlier, one of the key benefits of this approach is flexibility that could support further consolidation and help the buyers move forward. So to summarize this, the first key benefit that this model would offer is reduction in supply base over time, which could go well beyond this 20 to 30% mark. That is, more than 30% of reduction could be achieved, and it has no limit if the right supplier is found. Now, it would also be interesting to see how it could impact the overall cost savings. In this model, there could be 2 different cost saving opportunities, that are supply management cost and the cost of outsourced manufacturing. As a conservative estimate, we could say that potentially supply management cost could be further reduced by 10 to 15%, which would be driven by the reduction in the number of suppliers, as it would mean decreased cost of monitoring, lesser regulatory hassles, and lesser other costs that are associated with the supplier management. And talking about the cost of outsourced manufacturing, a rough estimate would be about 3 to 5% of savings. Since this model provides opportunity for increased business to supplier, buyer can also negotiate in profit margins. So overall, we can say that the total cost savings could be in the range of 5 to 10%. And as any company will have several hundreds of millions as total spending for outsourcing, this would mean a considerable amount of savings for the company. Having said that, once the savings are achieved, buyers would eye on the strategic and preferred partners for long-term engagements. As this proposed model will work on higher level of collaboration, integration, and transparency, it could also build the ground for increased understanding between the supplier and buyer. And hence, they both will be working together for a win-win situation. This will give the buyer more opportunity for strategic engagements such as exclusive manufacturing or dedicated manufacturing and future cost reduction opportunities that it can bring by working together with the supplier. So as we evaluated, this model looks beneficial to both suppliers and the buyers.
Well, Pradeep, if I may interrupt, this looks really interesting, but the idea that catches my curiosity at this point is, has it ever been tried in pharma industry so far? I mean, if there are any examples that you could share with us?
Well, I haven't been able to find any examples in the pharma industry so far, but there are certainly other examples. These type of engagements are not new to other industries. For example, let us consider medical devices industry. In medical devices, Insulet Corporation, an innovative medical devices marketer, has outsourced both the component as well as the final device manufacturing of its insulin pumps called Insulet Omnipod to Flextronics, who manufactures all the component parts like PCBs, LCDs, and the software and hardware integration part as well. Similarly, in soap manufacturing, Josil, a supplier who contract manufactures the required oils as well as the final product, is engaged by many global FMCG chains to manufacture the entire product from raw materials. Now, let's try to understand why not the pharma company has adopted this model. Outsourcing started to gain momentum in pharma industry maybe in the last 10 to 12 years only. As cost savings and supply security was key focus area, companies only engaged with core players in APIs and formulation. With changing scenario, we are seeing increased adoption of strategic engagements such as partnerships for drug development and manufacturing. However, currently the buyers have a perception that only core suppliers will be the best fit suppliers. Hence, overcoming this barrier could help them move ahead to work with integrated suppliers. However, at the same time, it's equally important to evaluate that if the supplier base is really ready to accept this opportunity. For this, Owais, can you enlighten us?
Thank you, Pradeep. As I mentioned earlier, it has been interesting to get to know the different aspects of this model so far. And I agree with you, it is also necessary to analyze the supply base. So let me take it forward. So first, talking about the concentration of such integrated players across the globe and taking a regional view, we find there is a considerable amount of concentration, particularly in emerging markets such as India and China, where the numbers of such integrated players who have facility approvals from different regulatory authorities like US FDA and European Medical Agency is well above 50. However, looking at the developed regions like US and some of the European countries, the concentration of such integrated players is lesser as compared to India and China. And the rest of the globe has an even lesser concentration. So we can say there already exists an opportunity, and especially in the emerging markets, where this model could be put to test. Furthermore, a key thing to observe is also some of the acquisitions that have taken place in the recent years. To take a few examples, Siegfried acquired Alliance Medical Products in 2012, DSM merged with Patheon in 2013, and recently Ambry acquired Cidarberg and Owais Biopharmaceutical. And to talk in brief details about them, Siegfried, traditionally having API manufacturing as their core competency, has now acquired capabilities in sterile filling. Similarly, DPX is now a full-line CMO with capabilities across the value chain and different geographies. And Ambry has further strengthened its position in the entire value chain for complex drug manufacturing. So to put it all together, we can say the concentration of such players at an overall global level is less at present. However, we do see onset of a trend where suppliers are now trying to diversify across the value chain. And which could further continue in future. And hence, there clearly exists a supplier base for this model that could be leveraged. So having evaluated this approach so far, we can say this approach could be looked upon as an option to manage the supply base and also considered for further evaluation. So at this point now, I'm wondering if there can be any outline that would also help us as a start point and give an idea how companies could go about implementing this model. So Pradeep, is it something that you could help us out with?
Surely, Owais. Let me sum it up by suggesting a roadmap for implementation of the proposed model. After having a thought about this model, major questions in every buyer's mind would be, who are the suppliers I need to work with? What are the drugs or product portfolio that I can bring under this model? And where can I implement this model? Let's address each of the above questions. Coming to what is the type of supplier I need to work with, we know that API manufacturing involves complex processes as compared to formulation. Hence, companies could work to identify their existing API supplier who also has capabilities to manufacture formulations. Next, what are the products that I can outsource? For this, we can say that it can be experimented with low volume matured brands and OTC brands to evaluate the cost savings and efficiencies gained. Depending on the success, the same can be extended to other generics as well. Now, where do I implement it? As stated earlier, India and China have a matured supply base that can provide end-to-end service. Also, as the regulatory requirements are much relaxed compared to developed nations, it would be easier to implement in these regions, thereby making these regions a perfect destination to start with. In addition to it, developed market also has a few players who can be tried upon, but as a next step to avoid risk. The whole process will take several years to implement across the globe for different product portfolios. However, as stated by a director of a big pharma company, any company would like to have a supplier base of just 10 suppliers who shall manage the major spend rather than hundreds of suppliers. This model can surely help us in achieving the company's vision, as its key benefits ease of supplier management, reduced cost of manufacturing, establishing strategic partnerships will make them truly a company ahead of the curve. So with that, I thank you all very much for taking out time and attending the webinar. We would be happy to answer your questions.
I see we have a couple of questions. First, considering the regulatory issues in emerging markets, how do you propose using emerging market players for any developed market needs?
Thank you, Mukund. Well, I would agree that there are certain issues in the emerging markets when we talk from a regulatory point of view. And the current scenario is that the API suppliers from the emerging markets are extensively used to support the developed markets. But at the same time, formulation manufacturers have received many warning letters from US FDA over the past years. So it would be difficult to engage with an emerging market player for developed markets. However, we can certainly engage with them for the emerging markets needs. And at the same time, like we have seen that there are players in the developed markets which could also be approached for this model. But when we say an emerging market players, it could be a difficult thing to work with emerging market players with this model for developed market needs. So we can say this model can be adopted differently for emerging markets and for different and with different suppliers for developed markets.
Thank you, Owais. We have another question. Pradeep, I believe this one should be for you. With strategic relationships already in place with suppliers, would it mean that a company has to compromise an existing relationship to adopt this model?
We do know that API manufacturing involves complex manufacturing processes compared to formulations, and hence you would suggest that it will be difficult to switch your API supply base. And thus, it is preferable to engage with a current API supplier for formulation as well. Maybe the current API manufacturer could be like developed to integrate forward as a formulation manufacturer as well. But please note that this model cannot be applied for all drugs, as your current supplier base might have a group of core suppliers concentrating only on APIs and formulations separately. Like HP APIs, like the HP APIs are being manufactured by API manufacturers separately and formulations separately. And hence, if a company is planning to outsource a new drug, this model can be tried upon.
Thank you, Pradeep. At this point, we don't have any other questions. So thank you everyone for your participation in this webinar. And thanks to Owais and Pradeep for their presentation today. Good day.